The second time, I call the member for Maitland.
Thank you, Mr Temporary Speaker, and I rise to contribute to this debate on this important bill introduced by the Shadow Minister for Family and Community Services, and I commend her for doing so. Unlike the member for Riverstone, I don't believe that there is no compelling evidence that we need to do more in this space. In our state, we have an obligation and a duty to provide a home and appropriate care to children who cannot be cared for by their parents. And this is a pressing problem in our state. We have more children in out-of-home care, particularly in the Aboriginal community, than we had at the time of the stolen generation. We have a generation of children who will grow up out of their parents' care and protection, and we need to take every step as a government, as a society, to ensure that that care is of the highest quality. And to hear members on the other side of this place stand up and talk about what would be the reason for strengthening this, and he thinks that it's all right and it's not a broken system. I mean, he was saying that we want to have a sector-blind system. We're dealing with issues that are not already there or not really there. I think we can say that when we look at cases like that of Girl X, there is a very serious issue in out-of-home care in this state. Children and young people who are placed in out-of-home care are the most vulnerable people in this state. Often they have experienced abuse and mistreatment, the likes of which no one in this place could even begin to comprehend. Many of the children who live in out-of-care homes are Indigenous or have a disability or have some other lifelong disadvantage that they are suffering from. We owe it to these children to make sure that they are safe and looked after. So this bill aims to ensure that non-government organisations entrusted by this government with the care of our state's children are meeting community expectations and upholding the contracts they sign with the government. And we talk about community expectations, but I have spoken previously in this place about the abuse that has happened to children in institutions run by do-gooders and well-intentioned governments, and I say to everyone on that side of the place, you need to act to ensure that every child in this state, in this community, is given the best chance, and that we take every opportunity to act on any allegations of abuse, but also to be proactive advocates for those children, to make sure that it's not just a case of getting the kids dressed and looking pretty for the inspector to come round, that we actually have proper auditing processes. The number of children and young people who are being placed in out-of-home care has been growing at an alarming rate. As was noted in the General Purpose Standing Committee No. 2's Child Protection Inquiry report, there are over 20,000 children at any one time living somewhere other than with their parents in New South Wales. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare has reported that nearly 10%, 9.9% of children in New South Wales are in care. This is second only to the Northern Territory. Now, in 2008, the Wood Special Commission into New South Wales Child Protection System made 111 recommendations to the then Labor government. In response to that report, Premier Nathan Rees and Minister Linda Burney released the Keep Them Safe report, which committed to implementing 106 of these recommendations, one of which was that out-of-home care provision should be transferred to the non-government sector. Now, this didn't actually happen until 2012, when Minister Goward began the transition, which was continued by Minister Hazzard in 2016. Unfortunately, this transition has been a rocky one. The contracts entered into by the current government with NGOs are flawed. At present, these contracts contain no provision that penalise a breach of duty of care to keep children safe from harm. This is a crucial but also unconscionable omission. We must ensure that if we entrust NGOs with the care of the children, and there can be no other greater trust than you place in an organisation to look after the most vulnerable and damaged children, then they must uphold their duty of care, and they must be called to account for this. The member for Riverstone talked about 20 years ago we put in some protections. Part of our responsibility in this place as legislators, as members of parliament, as governments, is to ensure that where we put in protections, if we see that there is a failure, we put in more protections. We do everything we can to ensure the safety of the most vulnerable children in our community. The Child Protection Inquiry report released by the General Purpose Standing Committee earlier this year identified a number of flaws within our child protection system. One of these was the lack of effective oversight by the government over the operations of NGOs who provide residential care to our children. And, you know, for the advisors over there who are advising ministers on this, have a look at what happened in the 1950s in post-war migration schemes, child migrant schemes. I've read those reports. I've spoken to some of those survivors, and I have a very good appreciation of what happens when government does not have effective oversight. Go and read the 1997 report of Bring Them Home, the story of the stolen generation, and hear the testimony of children who grew up in homes without effective oversight. Yes, we do it better, perhaps, but let's be sure we do it better. Let's not just stand here and make announcements that we think we're doing it better. Let's be sure. Because the people who put those children into care back then, they thought they were sure. So let us be doubly sure. Recommendation 12 of the report called on the government to extend the audit duties of the Auditor-General to review the operation of NGOs who deliver child protection services, and if we are to be sure that they are upholding their duty of care to the children of the state, we must have adequate oversight of NGOs' operations. Children in out-of-home care deserve independent, regular review of the organisations that provide their care. The number of children who spoke in those previous reports of inspectors flouncing in and out of homes and just saying everything looked okay when these children were starving, when they were being worked, when they spent every night being sexually and physically abused, is an indication that we need to do more. Children in and out of home care deserve to have proper oversight. The consequences of inadequate oversight are tragic. Over the past few years, we have seen case after case of mistreatment and abuse in out-of-home care facilities in this state. This evidence is looking people like the member for Riverstone in the face, Mr Temporary Speaker. The recent case of Braxton Slager, who was only 22 months old when he drowned while he was in temporary foster care. Yet another example of a young child failed by the current protection system. The police report into this child's death found that the premises was not safe nor secure enough to adequately house children in foster care. So what were they doing there if we have enough care and protection oversight in this state? Another tragic example of the current out-of-home care system was the case of Girl X. And Mr Temporary Speaker, I hate listing these out because it takes away the focus that this was a young girl, a 15-year-old girl, allegedly repeatedly abused in foster care, eventually dying of a drug overdose. In his report, the Deputy State Coroner, Derek Lee, found that she was extremely anxious about the prospect of testifying against her alleged rapist. You know, the government needs to get it clear in their head that kids who are victims of abuse in these homes are not going to stick their hand up. That is the very nature of the abuse. They are not going to volunteer evidence to some kind-looking person who just wanders into the home and says, is everything okay? We need proper oversight. This young woman wanted to stay out of trouble, and that's what the court heard, that she wanted to stay out of trouble, get a good job and live in a nice place when she turned 18. But this state, this child protection system and this government let her down, and the onus is on us to ensure that a case like this never occurs again. Never occurs again. It is unacceptable that sexual assault can occur anywhere, but particularly for someone that the state has taken in to provide additional protection. That is a disgrace. As the Shadow Minister for Prevention of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, I am wholeheartedly committed to ensuring that every child in New South Wales is safe from abuse, from violence or sexual assault. Our kids should be safe at school, in our hospitals, and they must be safe in foster care. It is not negotiable. Mr Speaker, can I request a short extension?
The question is that the member's time be extended. All that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Thank you. Before the end of this year, the Minister Goward is expected to finally release the sexual assault strategy for New South Wales. I take this opportunity to implore the Minister to support this bill. By increasing oversight in our foster care system, we will reduce the rate of sexual assault. The Girl X case is a case in point. Even if we just save one girl, the next girl, girl Y, that is worth it. The majority of non-government organisations are providing quality out-of-home care in difficult circumstances, and the member for Riverstone alluded to the lack of funding in this sector, the fact that they are trying to survive on a shoestring, on the smell of an oily rag. This bill will increase the accountability, and therefore some of those organisations, instead of being forced to take shortcuts and forced to not employ the best people to care for the most vulnerable people in our state, will be able to be backed in by legislation which supports a proper funding of this sector. This bill would place an obligation on the Minister for Family and Community Services to make sure that the Auditor-General conducts regular performance audits of those NGOs entrusted with providing out-of-home care to the most vulnerable children in our community. The performance audits undertaken by the Auditor-General would be tasked with determining whether or not the NGOs are efficiently but effectively undertaking their functions in compliance with legislation and their contract with the state. The Auditor-General would be able to make recommendations on how an NGO could improve its facilities and functions, and this would empower those organisations to go back to the Minister, to go back to this government and say, more please, we need more to deliver the important task that you have given us. And, I know, again, from my experiences in immigration, how tenuous the government is when it comes to really taking responsibility for the care of those children. And I urge the Minister to accept this legislation, to pass this legislation, for the very reason that it empowers the Minister to take her responsibility to care for these children, to delegate it out through contracts to the NGO sector seriously. Now, an audit under this legislation must be undertaken prior to the renewal of a contract between the department and the NGO, or within 3 months after the contract's been expired or terminated, to ensure the government remains accountable to the people of this state and to the parliament. Audit reports must be tabled by the Minister 1 month after they are received. What is wrong with having information that confirms the view of the member for Riverstone that nothing's wrong? Let's have the evidence. Let's make evidence-based decisions in these areas. The bill will make it an offence for any individual to obstruct an Auditor-General or any other individual from conducting an audit report. These are all sensible provisions that will deliver real reform to the provision of out-of-home care in this state. This bill will deliver two key things. It will ensure that NGOs who deliver out-of-home care are accountable to the government and to the public. It will also ensure that the vulnerable children who are in out-of-home care are safe from abuse and harm. It is essential that the government support this bill that's been introduced by the Shadow Minister for Family and Community Services, and I applaud her for doing so. It is consistent with the recommendations made in the Child Protection Inquiry Report, which was a bipartisan investigation. By empowering the Auditor-General to undertake regular and independent reviews of the NGOs entrusted with the provision of out-of-home care, this bill is all about increasing accountability and safety. And there can be no more important task in the whole field of child protection than increasing accountability and safety. That is what is at the heart of ripping children out of their parents' arms to make sure they are safe, and that the people that do that are accountable for their actions. Labor will always act to protect vulnerable people in this state. There is no group more vulnerable than the children who reside within out-of-home care. To ensure the safety of the children in this state, I implore the government to support this bill. Thank you.
The question is that this bill be